Tawe Barrage. The Tawe is naturally a tidal river. It's tidal, well, ships, small ships could go up to Morriston, and it's tidal even slightly beyond Morriston. And as a result, the banks of the river used to be very unsightly because they were just mud at low tide. And the city council in the 80s started to plan a barrage. I was actually on the city council at the time. And this is the barrage. It holds the water at high tide level. It releases lots of water, of course, otherwise it would just fall apart. But it holds it at the full tide level. So the river now, right the way up to Morriston, is a non-tidal river. And in theory, at least, you can enjoy trips up. There are boats go up there now, I wouldn't, if I were you, ever swim in it, because you're going through this massive area of industrial dereliction. And in many ways, this Tawe Barrage was the culmination of a series of attempts to do something about Swansea's industrial dereliction. We're looking up the valley here.
Push bike.
4 miles.
Come in. That way. That's it. Yeah. All right. Just keep pedaling. And then one coming down.
Whoops, hang on.
Roughly 4 miles up to Morriston, which was totally derelict. The first time I saw it was in the summer of 1961 when my parents moved down here, and I just couldn't believe it. I'd heard that Swansea was blitzed, but I thought it was rebuilt. It really was appalling. And the university began in the late 60s to explore means of bringing this back into use, of getting rid of the poison in the soil. And they travelled worldwide, worked with the city council, and they began experimental planting in 1970. And those plantations showed that you could, in fact, redo. The earth was reclaimable, or at least some of it was. But the problem was that it was 4 miles by a mile. That's a hell of an area, and where was the money going to come from? Well, it pains me to say, but it came from the Conservative government. Because when they came into power in 1979, the minister responsible, Sir Geoffrey Howe in fact, had one fixed idea in his head, that you should have enterprise zones with no planning restrictions and perhaps special privileges in terms of tax, though that never turned up. And he wanted to build them all over the country. The big problem was that not many assemblages of land were big enough to do it. Now, the whole of this area, right up to Morriston, belonged to the city council. It was the biggest single chunk of land ownership which he could access easily. And therefore there was a negotiation between the council and the Welsh office, as then was, on transferring it and making it into an enterprise zone. The price of making it into an enterprise zone as far as the city was concerned was that it wouldn't be industrial. It had to be commercial and industrial, and as you all know, it's purely commercial now, or virtually. There is some industry, but not very much. So that the quid pro quo was that it would be largely commercial. Sir Geoffrey Howe wasn't bothered about that. He just wanted these booming areas, and this was the first enterprise zone because I was on the council at the time, owned the land. That was why. And money was then poured in. Money which, the city could have done with long before. Then suddenly the floodgates opened, and something like an immediate 30 million down payment in 1979 up front was made available. And the total cost of land reclamation and some building in the enterprise zone was far in excess of that. And that was big money in 1979. And we could never have got money anywhere except from government. So the enterprise zone, people are always moaning about it because it's tin shacks, etc. But you should have seen what went there before, what was there before. I mean, it was a huge improvement. So as that developed after 1982 and became fairly prosperous, so the city began to think about the river. The enterprise zone, the big problem was poisoned land. Some of the land there was so poisoned that we were prohibited from carrying the earth away. So the city asked the obvious question, what are we going to do with it? And in those days, what we were told was dig a hole, a deep hole, put it in. I really would never go into the water of the lake or the river, because the poisons must seep out somewhere. And the joke is that if you fish in the Tawe, you use a magnet. I think that's overstated, but nonetheless, the dereliction was amazing. So the idea of making the Tawe navigable all the way up to Morriston and beyond, in fact, for very small boats, was a natural outcome of the enterprise zone, to get rid of these unsightly banks and to make the river look pleasant. At the same time, the development we're about to go in on the south dock was being done. And the south dock was the big dock built in 1859. A very big dock by the standards of the age, but relatively shallow and difficult for big ships to get into. And by really the 1930s, it was beginning to run down badly. By the 1960s, the whole area was pretty well derelict. The Victoria Station, which used to stand there, well, the railway line was got shot of, the station buildings were still there decaying. The whole area was a mass of decaying buildings. There was what to do with it? Well, it belonged to the Docks Board. And the Docks Board, whatever one may say about it, isn't over-imaginative. And their idea was to fill it in. Their idea was to fill in the whole of the South Dock. And then let it out for industrial and commercial usage. That was their idea. They filled it half in. They filled half of it in. And then they ran out of money and they didn't know what to do with it. And it was really in the 70s a quite remarkable mess. The biggest business there was Dal the Builder's Pal, which was an enormous builder's yard. And he had, the owner, had a huge balloon, a gas balloon. And he used to float round the skies in South Wales with his big slogan, Dal the Builder's Pal, which I think did a lot of good for Swansea. But in the end, there was only one really big firm there which produced bottle tops, Spontex. They continued, and there were a few other businesses, but the city decided that as they acquired the land from the docks, something had to be done with it. And the answer was to develop it as a marina with housing. And from the first it was envisaged as a mixed development. People in the marina sometimes get upset because there are cafes and loud noises at night, but it was always envisaged as a mixed development. That was made very clear. The process was controlled by a special committee upon which I did not sit, of very powerful members of the council who decided there was no planning, as in the enterprise zone, no planning. Decisions were made by about 4 members of council. Without reference to council, in order to make sure that to push it through. And the result is quite a success. I mean, when it first started, the housing opened into a slump in the housing market, just one of those things, just like SA1. One of the ways it profited Swansea was that people moored boats over winter here. And our costs here were price of a mooring here was about 1/3 to 1/2 that of Brighton Marina. So you used to see a lot of boats marked Brighton as their home port. And it has been quite a success because The original housing development was to the north. In 1987, I think it was, Spontex burnt down. I happened to be travelling across the city, and there was this great, enormous cloud of smoke sweeping across the city. Fabian Way was closed, and I had to travel eastwards, onto the motorway. And the Spontex factory burnt down. Spontex were then relocated into the enterprise zone, which matched very nicely, and the city took ownership of their site and built more housing there and more leisure activities. So this is really an effort to come to terms with the dereliction in Swansea. But it has been pointed out by a colleague of mine in geography that even in its derelict state, with only Spontex really as a big firm, it actually employed more people than are presently employed around the marina. And that's, in the nature of things. But this is a success story of a modest kind. The river is quite pleasant now. It's not as derelict as it looked. You can still sometimes see bits of the old wooden staging that stuck out into the river. There's still bits of it showing occasionally. But we walk into the marina, and then from the marina we walk back to our starting point. Some of you may want to buzz off there, but we'll go and have a look at the marina.